Friends, Kansas Cityans, fellow library enthusiasts, lend me your ears. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. Thanks for joining us this evening. If I may continue paraphrasing Mark Antony by way of William Shakespeare, David Stockman comes before us tonight to bury Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not to praise him. Along the way, I suspect he also will inter, or perhaps take to the woodshed, individuals as varied as economists John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, central bankers Arthur Burns, Alan Greenspan, and Ben Bernanke, presidents Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, and Congressman Paul Ryan. The same goes for such institutions as the federal government, the Federal Reserve, Fannie Mae, and Wall Street banks. And that's the short list. In David Stockman's telling of it, they're just the more prominent names on a bipartisan roster of co-conspirators responsible for creating a hybrid welfare state, warfare state that has fostered a mutant form of crony capitalism, an out-of-control malignancy that is now leading inexorably to state wreck in the not-too-distant future. In a recent New York Times article titled "Sundown in America," he calls this state of affairs, quote, "the Great Deformation," an outcome arising from a rogue central bank that has abetted the Wall Street casino, crucified savers on a cross of zero interest rates, and fueled a global commodity bubble that erodes Main Street living standards through rising food and energy prices. Not everyone at the helm of the American governmental-economic complex over the past 80 years comes in for condemnation. Senator Carter Glass, the foremost banking expert of the 1930s and whose name graces the long-lost first half of the Glass-Steagall Act, is remembered as, quote, "a deeply knowledgeable and stern taskmaster." President Dwight Eisenhower and his Fed chairman, William McChesney Martin, are hailed as exemplars of sound money and fiscal discipline. Fed chairman Paul Volcker gains kudos for his resolve that brought the roaring inflation of the 1970s under control by the mid-1980s. And Sheila Bair, a Kansas native with 2 degrees from my beloved University of Kansas, who was chair of the FDIC from 2006 to 2011, is called, quote, "the single best informed and most tough-minded and courageous official in Washington at the time of the 2008 financial meltdown." But in his new book, The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America, we are treated to a revisionist history in which most of the key players are culprits. As a late-blooming prairie populist, I'd have a hard time arguing with many of these characterizations. David Stockman brings extraordinary credentials to this comprehensive retelling of how we got to where we are. After earning degrees from Michigan State and Harvard Divinity School, he began his rise to prominence in 1976 when he was elected to Congress as a Republican from a district in Michigan. In 1981, he was chosen by President Reagan to serve as budget director, and thus became one of the key architects of the Reagan Revolution. After he resigned from the administration in 1985 over serious policy differences, David Stockman became one of the early partners of the Blackstone Group and became an extremely successful equity investor. The Great Deformation is available for sale, courtesy of our friends at Reading Reptile, and David will be signing copies following his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Stockman.
Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, I'm going to put my bottle of water right up here on the top of the podium so that when I have my Senator Rubio moment, I won't have to reach down and lose track of where I am. Of course, you know, unlike Senator Rubio, or for that matter, our distinguished president, I do not have a teleprompter tonight. And believe it or not, what I'm about to say I came up with myself. So you can hold me responsible. I would also like to thank Henry for such kind words about my book, because it's never happened before so far on the book tour after 2 months. As you know, it came out 2 months ago. And so far, it has been denounced by the right and the left and Republicans and Democrats and Keynesians and monetarists and supply-siders, and also by Wall Street and K Street and the military-industrial complex, and also by the neocons, the social cons, and the just cons. And the latter category, in case you don't know, is the catch-all for everybody else in Washington, not included above. And of course, they're not very happy with my book, any of these categories, because I do take on practically everybody, I will admit to that. I do have heroes in the book, as Henry said. Sheila Bair, for instance, is a hero because she was ignored entirely, unfortunately, by the Fed and the White House when they were bailing out Wall Street. And most of the other heroes in my book, like Calvin Coolidge and Carter Glass, are dead. But nevertheless, I think I have a fair rendition of history. But in any event, the fundamental thesis is a plague on both of your houses, that in a sense, both parties have become glorified concierges. Their primary job these days is to introduce politicians to money and PACs and to the K Street lobbies so they can get reelected. I don't think they stand for very much anymore. I've laid this out in great length, in fact, 700 pages worth in my book. I'm going to touch on some of those tonight. So it's not surprising that our institutions have become deformed and distorted. I think the Fed has become a serial bubble machine. I think our budget is totally out of control, regardless of what they've been telling you in the headlines in the last few weeks, and that in a sense it's become a doomsday machine because both parties are so locked in to fundamental positions that are both wrong and incompatible that I don't see how we're ever going to stop the trillion-dollar red ink from continuing to mount and the national debt from becoming really ultimately destructive reality. But in any event, so it is fair enough that there have been a lot of brickbats thrown my way as a result of what I've said in the book. But I think Professor Paul Krugman went over the top just a little bit. Now, some of you may be aware that he is the self-anointed and self-appointed tribune of all matters on economics, of correctness on all matters of economics. And he simply dismissed my book as the ravings of a cranky old man. And, you know, that even aroused my 85-year-old mother, who, upon reading the Krugman blog, which was actually entitled Cranky Old Man, immediately shot back an email to me saying, "Doesn't he know? Actually, you were a cranky young man, too," and you never really got over it. But it seems like, in all seriousness, that there must be a lot of cranky people in America, old, young, or in between, because within days of his blog, Cranky Old Man blog appearing, and I don't say this in a boastful way, my book shot up to the very top of the list. And there were only several things that stopped it. 2 diet books, and something called The Walking Dead, which I'm told is, you know, some kind of horror story. But it may be apropos to the zip code that I'm in as I try to lay out this revisionist history. Now, I have to say that as a result of all the commotion and the disputation and the denunciation that was created, actually the book, the first week that it came out, was number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I'm not saying this, again, to boast. I'm saying it because the Times is still debating whether that was number 4 in the fiction category or the nonfiction category. According to most of the liberals and Keynesians, it should be in the fiction category. But anyway, before we began tonight, I noticed several people were carrying the book with 2 hands and noticing its girth. It does weigh 3 pounds. It is 700 pages long. Because after all, when you're trying to rewrite history and correct all the errors that have been made since the New Deal, it takes a lot of pages. At least that's what I thought. But anyway, Henry was suggesting quite discreetly, is there some way that you could please to condense your thoughts for this evening? And so I'm happy to say that I've done that. And the good news is that I've reduced the whole thing, if you can believe this, to 5 very pithy sound bites. The bad news is that each one of them is 100 pages long. So what I would like everybody to do is put your feet up and relax, and we'll get into some, I think, interesting matters. Now, I have to say that people who have heard or either read the book or read about it or heard some of my statements about it have said, well, are you saying that we have basically gotten so far off track that the system doesn't work anymore, that we're having bubble after bubble, that the Fed is out of control, that Congress and the budget is out of control, and that there isn't any safe place to put our money? Are you really saying that we should be putting our money under our mattress? And I want to clarify right from the beginning, before we get into the heavy-duty part of this, is I am not saying that at all. People have totally misinterpreted what I'm saying. I'm suggesting the only safe place is to put your money in your mattress at the rate at which we're going. In any event, let me suggest that the book is really about 4 cardinal virtues of public policy. And those are big kind of thoughts, but I think they're important because then you can develop and go into depth on each. Fiscal rectitude, sound money, free markets, and household thrift and responsibility. And the book is about how we have progressively lost each of these over the last 80 years, but especially since August 1971, when Richard Nixon went to Camp David with the most free market economists ever gathered under one roof and came up with a program called the NEP. Now, some of you may actually remember that, the new economic policy. It consisted of comprehensive wage and price controls, closing the gold window, defaulting on our Bretton Woods obligations, import surtaxes, and a lot else. But the irony was NEP was first invented by Lenin in 1921. And the new economic policy was his desperate effort to actually rescue the faltering Soviet economy in its early pioneering days from the collectivism he's introduced. So it was a small irony that you get all these free market economists under one roof and they come up with the NEP. But of all the things that was done in that program, which was a major turning point in history, and I lay it out in my book, of all the things that were done, the part that is probably not really appreciated and understood is that Nixon defaulted on Bretton Woods. He ended the period that worked well of fixed exchange rates. He ended any kind of anchor on the central bank of the United States and on the rate at which money was being created, and thereby inaugurated a 40-year period that people then could not imagine what it would lead to, but it's finally led to a world today in which the economies are totally dominated by central banks who are addicted to money printing, monetizing government debt, manipulating and rigging all the financial markets, the debt markets, the equity markets, and all the rest of it. And as a result, we have totally transformed the system over that period of time. And Nixon did that for some fairly bad reasons. So the point that I have in the book about heroes and villains is not exactly because I want to call names or something like that, but I want to call attention to turning points in history that have made a big difference. Now, why did Nixon, with all of these so-called conservative advisors and sound economic advice, why did he decide to close the gold window, shut down Bretton Woods, put the world money system and central banks on a floating rate basis, and inaugurate a totally new world? Well, the answer was he inherited an economy that was inflating rapidly, that was in big trouble because of the guns and butter policy of Johnson, and he was unwilling to tell the truth to the public that we needed to go through a period of adjustment. We needed to slow down our economy. It was red hot. It was overproducing, overgrowing. That we needed to balance the budget. We needed financial discipline, and that might even cause a recession, which he found to be highly inconvenient, because a year from August 1971 was the upcoming election, and so in order to get the economy booming, and I have a section in my book where I actually lay out, because we're blessed with the fact that everything that was said in the Oval Office then was recorded. So you can read the words, and the words say, I want the economy booming by July 1982, or 1972, and I don't care how much inflation there is. I don't care what the rest of the world thinks about it. I don't care what it does to our obligations to convert dollars to gold, an obligation that we had taken on when we created the Bretton Woods system. I don't care about any of that. I want the economy booming. I want a huge, wave behind me for the election. So I call Nixon a cynical politician who really, at the end of the day, when you look at history carefully, had no principles, notwithstanding that he had been a conservative Republican, notwithstanding the fact that he had served under Eisenhower, who in my book ends up being the exemplar of fiscal rectitude, because Eisenhower did balance the budget 4 out of 8 times. Eisenhower did worry about building the national debt. Eisenhower did worry about a military-industrial complex that might get out of control. Well, notwithstanding his alleged conservative background, notwithstanding the tutelage under a great man that he had during the Eisenhower era, notwithstanding the good performance of the economy that happened during the 50s and early 60s, when Eisenhower was in the White House and someone by the name of William McChesney Martin was in the Fed, we had the golden era of economic performance, which is kind of hard to even remember today. GDP grew by 3 to 3.5% over that 8 or 9 year period. Inflation was 1%. We did not have any financial crises. We did not have any meltdowns on Wall Street. We did not have any housing booms and busts. None of the things that have impaired the performance of our economy in the last 10 or 15 years happened during then. But Nixon came into office believing that he lost the 1960 election because Eisenhower had been too stiff, as he called it, on the fiscal issue, and insisted on balancing the budget, even if that meant raising taxes, which Eisenhower actually did, or cutting back some popular spending programs, or really holding down the defense budget, all of these things which he did. He also had a tremendous grievance against the Federal Reserve, and William McChesney Martin, who tightened the money supply, had to, because inflation was beginning to creep up in 1960. He believed that he lost to Kennedy as a result of William McChesney Martin. And his number one goal when he got in the White House was to get Martin out of the Fed and get the Fed under control, and he found Arthur Burns and put him in there. Arthur Burns started the printing press and was given the ability to do that. And this is the key point of why I'm dwelling on this. He was given the ability to do that when Nixon closed the gold window, defaulted on Bretton Woods, and unleashed the central bank to be run by 12 people on the so-called open market committee who were free to create as much money or as little money as they felt was right for the economy at any given moment. But unfortunately, even in those early days in 1971, Arthur Burns and Nixon proved that when you don't have the central bank anchored to an external discipline, it starts to make up excuses and reasons why it ought to accommodate the inflation that's underway, why it ought to crank up the printing press for a little while longer. And of course, what came out of that was the disaster of the 1970s, the great inflation, double-digit inflation, and the near failure of our economy during that period. So there is a lot more to this whole story, but that is one of the inflection points that gets us to where we are today. A second one is what I call the fiscal accident of this Reagan Revolution, which I was a part of. And I can assure you that Ronald Reagan believed in balanced budgets, was not intending to create $2 trillion of additional national debt during his 8 years of office and the 4 years that followed with Bush. But unfortunately, he had embraced a program in the 1980 election which defied math. That is, a huge buildup in defense, deep, drastic tax cuts, and a balanced budget within 2 years. Now, each of these were appropriate and justifiable goals, but the math didn't work. I was naive enough when I became budget director in 1981, after being in the Congress for a few years, to believe that there had been some kind of mandate, that the public had been scared to death by double-digit inflation, and so therefore the Congress could change its ways and that we could cut spending enough to accommodate some expansion of defense, have the tax cuts, revive the economy, stay on a glide path towards balance. Well, within 7 months, we found out that wasn't possible. Number one, the Pentagon got totally out of control. I've said this before, but there's a whole chapter in the book that you might be interested in. Rather than have a modest increase in defense spending, which may or may not have been justified, the neocons got control of the Pentagon, and they basically convinced everyone that we were faced with a basically lethal, fatal threat to our civilization, because the Soviet Union was developing a first strike capability, a nuclear superiority. Now, we know in the hindsight of history, but it should have been obvious to a lot of people then, that the Soviet Union was falling apart on its own weight because socialism doesn't work, central planning doesn't work, command and control economies don't work, and rather than being some profound existential threat to our future, it was something that we needed to wait out with the military capacity for a so-called MAD, mutual assured destruction, second strike capability that we had in place at the time. But the neocons got control of the policy machinery. They got the president's ear, unfortunately, and we had a massive, unwarranted, unneeded buildup in defense that ended up being about twice the size that had been penciled out during the campaign. Then the second thing that happened was that when we tried to cut taxes, and there was a good case for cutting taxes then, when we tried to cut taxes, a bidding war erupted on Capitol Hill because we were finally seeing that in a political system dominated by special interest groups, even then the PACs were powerful, that the way you get things done is create log-rolling coalitions, trade-offs, deals, and they sprouted up everywhere. And we ended up with a tax cut that was double the size that he had originally intended, included all kinds of ornaments and giveaways to every special interest groups, from the oil industry to the savings and loan industry, that was never part of the original program. So here we go with defense heading way higher than intended, taxes being cut dramatically more than the original plan called for, which was an individual rate cut. And then we were unable, because the Republicans finally, and I don't say this to pick on Republicans, I knew then, even then, the Democrats were hopeless, but the Republicans were unwilling to put their votes where their rhetoric was. The Lincoln Day dinner speeches about big government and the runaway welfare state and entitlements out of control and too many government departments and employees and all the rest of it didn't translate when it came to votes. And so we ended up, unbelievably, and despite all the speeches you've heard since then, we ended up cutting the budget, the domestic budget that we inherited from Jimmy Carter, which represented the accretion of decades, the Great Society, the huge expansion under Nixon and Ford, going back to the New Deal. We ended up cutting it by 0.3% of GDP. In other words, it was almost a rounding error. The domestic budget was 14.7% of GDP when Jimmy Carter left, and of course he was the big government, big spending ogre. When Reagan left office in 1988, it was 14.5% of GDP. That's not very much change at all, because on the big entitlements programs, so-called social insurance, Medicare, Social Security, and so forth, nothing was really done. Now, what did that add up to? It added up to a massive structural deficit that totaled over the 12 years of Republican administrations at that time more than $2 trillion. And you can say today, well, that doesn't mean too much to you, but I want to tell you, back in those days, the whole deficit, the whole national debt that had been created from the beginning till 1980 was $1 trillion. And by the time this program to fundamentally change and shrink big government and put it on a course of fiscal rectitude was done, the error factors had become so large that by the end we added $2 trillion to the national debt. It was $3 trillion when the 12 years ended versus the $1 trillion where we started. Now, it's bad enough that the national debt was added to by that huge magnitude at a time when there really wasn't a crisis. I mean, we weren't in something to the equivalent of World War II. The economy had problems, but it was nothing that required some kind of crazy emergency deficit finance. Yet, we ended up adding this much to the national debt, but even worse. We added a legacy that deficits were tolerable, deficits don't matter, and the Republican Party unfortunately adopted that creed over the years and decades ahead, and that's probably why we have 17 trillion of national debt today, because the really bad thing that came out of the Reagan era was not the numbers, was not the failure of a plan that made sense philosophically but didn't add up mathematically. The bad thing, the legacy that came out of that era was the theory that deficits are tolerable, deficits don't matter, that we can basically blame the other party, point the finger at someone else, and then get on with the good things. And so the Republican Party became a free lunch party, in my view, just like the Democratic Party. And the Republicans became the party of tax cutting for any reason, any time, on any occasion that the economy seemed like it needed a little help, notwithstanding where the fiscal accounts were, notwithstanding the size of the deficit or the path on which the national debt was underway. And so when we got, if you don't have a conservative party in a democracy, a welfare state democracy like ours, I think you end up with a very bad equation. It's a competitive race to the bottom fiscally. The Republicans dismantled the revenue system, so by a year ago we were down to 14 or 15% of GDP in revenue. Ronald Reagan targeted 19.5% of GDP, and even he said that much we need in order to pay the bills of government. Well, here, 25 years later, after learning the wrong lesson, and I lay this out in some detail in my book, Republicans were defending a revenue take at this 15, 16% level that isn't possibly viable in a system where we're spending 23 or 24% of GDP. So that was the next big turning point in which basically our system became unhinged because the party of fiscal rectitude gave up its job. I've always said the Republican Party, the conservative party in a democracy, has a job of hard labor on the oars of fiscal rectitude, which is to say, occasionally telling the public the truth, occasionally honoring the basic requisites of math, occasionally saying you can't have it all, we've got to make choices, trade-offs, cutbacks. Some of these things sound great in theory, but they're unaffordable. Well, if you really think about it, when have you last heard a party telling you that something wasn't affordable? Not in the abstract, they all can give that speech. But how many have told you that what we're spending on education today, $90 billion compared to $4 billion when Ronald Reagan was trying to eliminate the Department of Education, that isn't affordable and we need to make some choices? Or that Social Security isn't affordable for everyone, including the affluent retirees, where we're spending $800 billion a year and there's no reserves in there, just confetti that they pretend has been accumulated over the years. So a very serious deformation occurred during the Reagan era, not just because the numbers came out so disastrously bad, but because the legacy, because of the way the two-party system ended up being a competition from two free lunch parties. And then the third turning point was in the 1990s when Greenspan, who was appointed to be chairman of the Fed in 1987, who followed the great Volcker, who actually did tell the public the truth, who did tell Wall Street the truth, who told us early in the Reagan administration, you're not going to like this, interest rates are going to soar, but if we're going to break the back of double-digit inflation, we have to take the medicine, we have to endure the pain, or double-digit inflation will get utterly out of control and will end up with a totally failed economy. And to his credit, Ronald Reagan stuck by Volcker. Volcker got the job done, but I want to tell you, it was a job done by one guy, never repeated again. He couldn't have been elected on Capitol Hill to that job. He was an accident because Jimmy Carter was desperate. But he did the job. He paved the way for the economy going back to a little more stable, non-inflationary prosperity. But Greenspan came in, and Greenspan basically began drinking the the Republican prosperity Kool-Aid, which basically said, these deficits we can work around by running the printing press rather than allowing their impact to filter through the financial markets. What I'm saying is, by 87, 88, and 89, and I lay this out to some good degree in the book, the economy was ready for another crisis. Interest rates were rising. That's why we had the big stock market crash in 1987. It was a signal that the government was still borrowing way too much, that we were tapping the savings supply to fund deficits that we shouldn't have had, that therefore we needed basically to have a fundamental fix of the fiscal equation, which was still 4 or 5% of GDP deficit, which in those days was unheard of or novel. But Greenspan basically came up with the idea that we can defer the day of reckoning by running the printing press harder and by ultimately exporting the inflation that was being created by the huge Reagan-Bush deficits and the interest rate pressure to the rest of the world. He discovered that the rest of the world was as economically illiterate as most of the people were in Washington. And as a result of that, the central banks of all the great Asian economies that were just then rising, China had opened its economy to the West. Mr. Deng had said, it's glorious to be rich, if you remember, in the early 90s. The Central Bank of China then lowered its exchange rate, pegged its currency, and they adopted what I call export mercantilism, a policy basically of exporting at any cost with wages that were, 50 cents an hour or less. In other words, draining their massive, desperate workforce out of the rice paddies and into the new factories in the East. exporting to the United States with a peg currency, that is an unfair advantage, and then buying all the Treasury debt that we issued in order to fund the big deficits of the Reagan era, Reagan-Bush era, and to have prosperity, our cake and eat it too, to have a booming economy that we had in the 1990s. Now, everybody thinks the 1990s was a golden era, but what really was happening is that we were just exporting our manufacturing business, our tradable goods sector to the Far East. They were buying our debt. We were buying their goods. All of Main Street America was living at 104 or 105% of its income. Everybody was borrowing. Household debt soared. The money that was being printed by the Fed ended up in the canyons of Wall Street, and we had a massive boom in the stock market that finally ended, as you all remember, in the tears of the dot-com crash in 2001. During that 10-year period, or really the first, 13 years of the Greenspan era, the stock market went up by 5-fold. Now, I'm not saying 5% or 50%, I'm saying 500%. And there's no way that anything in a healthy economy can go up by 500% over that long period of time. And what happened was a speculative mania was created, a culture, I call it the bull market culture, was created, in which much of America was induced into the illusion that you don't have to save anymore. All you have to do is put your money in the stock market and it'll double, it'll triple, it'll quadruple. That's your savings for retirement. Meanwhile, live high on the hog, take on one mortgage, two mortgages, don't save anything, because in this new era of what I call bubble finance and massively rising stock prices and other financial asset prices, you can basically take care of your retirement and your obligation to save for a rainy day by looking for easy windfalls in the stock market. So what happened was, and people don't recognize these things, because one of the bad things about printing press money, about bubble finance, is that you become used to it. It becomes a way of life. Everybody begins to drink the Kool-Aid, and pretty soon we have fundamentally changed circumstances that people don't really recognize or as the threat that they are. But the truth is that for most of the 30 years of prosperity that we had after World War II, the savings rate in this country was about 8.5% to 10%. And that was when the workforce was young, when households were being formed, and so therefore that's probably the minimum that you need to have a healthy economy and to provide for the future of a large, prosperous society like the United States. Well, as we got into the third inflection point, what I call the era of bubble finance that Greenspan inaugurated in the 1990s, really with the panic that started in 1987 after Black Monday, when he just opened up the printing press when the stock market crashed for good reason. It was way out of control. But in any event, as a result of this going on for over a decade, by the end of the century, by the end of the 90s, the savings rate in America was down to 2%. Nothing was being saved. Everybody was gambling in the stock market or then in the housing market. Everybody was confident that these huge values would be there when the time came. And then the dot-com bust happened, and $5 trillion worth of accumulated paper wealth that the households of America thought they had disappeared within a few months. Now, the reason that my book is a pretty serious attack on Greenspan is that rather than learn a sobering lesson that when you run the printing press as fast as he did, when you create the Wall Street coddling measures like the so-called Greenspan put, and bailouts. They bailed out long-term capital, as some of you may remember, in 1998. It never should have happened. Long-term capital was just a reckless gambling house based in Greenwich, Connecticut, by the way, where I live, that employed 200 people that gambled with $100 billion on 100-to-1 leverage under some fancy new trading technology. They should have let it go under. They should have let all of the banks that were loaning all that money to long-term capital take a hit, but instead, Greenspan panicked, opened up the spigot. They bailed out long-term capital, and the word was on in the Wall Street, in the financial market, the Fed has your back. There's a safety net underneath that if you gamble, you win on the upside, and if things go sour, go wrong, they're going to step in and put a safety net underneath. That was the lesson of long-term capital. And within the next 5 or 6 years, amazing things happened in Wall Street that they never tell you about, but I've laid it out to some degree in my book because I think it's important. The 10 largest banks in the United States, the Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs and Lehman, the big commercial banks like J.P. Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, and so forth, had a combined balance sheet of $2 trillion at the end of the 90s, just as Greenspan was getting things cranked up. And then, after Glass-Steagall was repealed, after the dot-com crash, and then Greenspan panicked and lowered interest rates for 3 years running from 6.5% to 1%, 85% reduction in the Fed-controlled short end of the market. It unleashed a growth and merger and investment in gambling frenzy among these banks like you've never seen before. And without going into all of the excruciating detail, I can say that by the eve of the crash in 2008, those banks had combined balance sheets of $11 trillion. They were levered over 30 to 1. They were funding themselves with overnight money and rolling it every day in order to invest in all of the kind of toxic securities that had been created in what I call the meth labs of Wall Street over the previous 10 years. The CDOs, the CDO squared, the various kinds of mortgage-backed securities, the CDS, and so forth. So Greenspan didn't learn the right lesson. He reflated the bubble. And as a result of that, we got the disaster of 2007, 2008. But I think it's interesting that once you get in the bubble and the leadership, whether at the central bank or in Washington or the White House or Congress, begins drinking the Kool-Aid heavily, people can't recognize how dangerous financial bubbles are that are created by the printing press. In 2002, when the economy was still struggling after the dot-com crash, and some serious lesson should have been learned by Main Street America, you got to stop spending and start saving and become more prudent, or should have been learned by the mandarins running the central bank. I call it the Monetary Politburo because essentially they think they're in charge of everything. But instead of learning those lessons, they reflated, and the guru of all of them, Professor Paul Krugman, actually wrote a column in 2002, said, Greenspan, hear this. The country is suffering from the dot-com crash. You need to inflate another bubble to get us out of this, and I recommend you inflate a housing bubble. It's right there in black and white. Now, when you think of the millions of American households who got lured into that chase of housing prices higher and higher and higher and higher, and got into mortgages that they couldn't afford, or got into subprimes, which were basically predatory, and ended up out on the street losing it all or going through the catastrophes that so many millions of families have had to live with. When you think about all of that, and yet the leading economic thinker on the left side anyway says, wouldn't it be great to have a housing bubble? Anyway, that's why the third inflection point is what I call the Greenspan and then Bernanke notion of a central bank that basically thinks it can create prosperity by massive creation of new money, by huge expansion of its balance sheet, by lowering interest rates so low that people will be induced to borrow even if they shouldn't. And I might say that the end of all of this is that by 2007, America had essentially performed on itself a rolling leverage buyout. In other words, there was so much debt on the economy, household, business, and government, that it added up to $51 trillion. That was 3.5 times GDP. And you may say, well, these are huge numbers. What do they mean to me? The answer is that until 1980, when this really got going, and until these big mistakes were made in Camp David with Nixon, in the 80s with Reagan, in the 90s and after with Greenspan and Bernanke, the ratio of debt to our national income had always been 1.6 times. Not 3.6 times, 1.6 times. And that, if you can look at it in its totality, means that there was 30 trillion of debt on the economy, in the household sector, on business balance sheets, that wouldn't have been there had we stuck to the traditional financial disciplines, to the traditional notions of savings and thrift, to the traditional idea that businesses that have a good idea should invest sweat equity and financial equity but not lever themselves to the hilt. Had we stuck with those traditional notions, which I think were undermined dramatically by these policy changes, we would be, the U.S. economy today would be carrying 30 trillion less debt. And the reason why we can't recover, the reason why the Main Street economy continues to struggle, frankly, is that 30 trillion of debt that was created. Now, if you listen to the people who are telling us that the solution to the crash in 2008 and 2009 is more debt, and that's why would the Fed be putting interest rates at zero effectively, at 10 basis points, 0.1%? The only reason for this crazy monetary policy, this massive bond buying, this total rigging of the financial market by the Fed is it wants everybody to borrow more money on the grounds that if everybody starts borrowing again, we can somehow borrow our way to prosperity. Well, I say that that is a fundamental insult to the wisdom of the ages. People knew better. And it's then one of the reasons I've tried to do a revisionist history in this book is to remind people that what the mainstream, I should say, felt to be reasonable, prudent, rational, and appropriate as recently as 1980 has been thrown out, totally thrown to the winds today. Now, maybe the argument for why we have all of this debt and we ought to then encourage business and households to start borrowing again, that's what they tell you every day, is that we're certifiable, under the definition of insanity that Einstein once laid out. Einstein once said, the mark of insanity is if people do the same thing over and over and over and expect a different result. And that's about what's happening today. So either we have a case of some kind of collective insanity, or the traditional virtues, the traditional financial wisdom, the historic notions of paying your bills, living within your means, keeping your national budget balanced, keeping your accounts with the rest of the world balanced, all of that we've lost since 1970. In fact, since 1970, on the latter score, we have not had one current account surplus with the rest of the world since 1970, and we've borrowed $88 trillion from the rest of the world in the interim deficit after deficit after deficit, massive trade deficits in order to live beyond the income that we're producing. Now, either the traditional wisdom that I'm talking about here was wrong, or we've made a huge mistake. And I think implicitly what the spenders and the Keynesians and the central bank money printers are saying today is that we were simply benighted for decades and centuries, and that if we would only have known about the magic elixir of debt and gotten the American people borrowing up to the hilt and the federal government running massive deficits, we could have had untold prosperity decades and decades and decades ago. We might have become so wealthy that by 1950, actually, they would have invented the internet way back then, not in 1990. And it might have been invented by Senator Albert Gore Sr. of Tennessee and not Albert Gore Jr. Of Hollywood. Who knows? But the point is, my argument is the current Fed and the values of debt and low interest rates and borrowing and speculation that it's generated has fundamentally transformed, I use the word deformed, the way our economy works. Now, the next inflection point in my book is the Bush abomination. And I'm not talking here just about having two wars that were totally unnecessary, inappropriate, unjustified, and never should have happened, or two tax cuts that were massive, that we couldn't afford, and that added so much to the national debt. I believe in lower taxes rather than higher taxes, but I also believe in paying your bills. And I would point out, some people are shocked to know this, that in 28 years of Republican White Houses since Eisenhower, Republicans have not produced one balanced budget in 28 years, okay? And so then we get to Bush, and it's sort of the apotheosis of the Republican apostasy about fiscal rectitude. The principle is turned on its head. They deliberately generate these huge deficits in peacetime when we had the appearance of prosperity, and I say the appearance only, because obviously it was all being fueled by speculation, the housing bubble, and so forth. But in any event, we ended up with the Bush era in which everything was thrown to the wind. We had a record growth in the welfare state during that period. Medicare, as you know, Part D was expanded. Farm subsidies reached their highest point in history in real terms, even though we were in the biggest commodity bubble ever. Energy boondoggles appeared everywhere. We blame Obama for these, but actually they were all started under Bush. Homeland Security got totally out of control, quadrupled without any oversight or serious discipline at all. Pork barrel spending came out everywhere. And then they appointed Bernanke to head the Fed. Okay, it wasn't appointed by some radical left-wing community organizer from Chicago, although he did reappoint him. But they put Bernanke in charge of the Fed, who had written monographs saying that when push comes to shove, run the printing press, dump money out of a helicopter, and borrow your way to prosperity. So this is the Republican economics. It was basically an economic policy that repudiated everything the party had historically stood for. And then finally, in the last chapter, we get to what I would call the doom being sealed when Obama inherited this mess. But unfortunately, not only did he know nothing about economics, had he not really developed any studied understanding about what the central bank does, what the fiscal condition of the country is, why our economy was beginning to perform so poorly, but he appointed to the top positions unreconstructed, recycled Keynesians like Larry Summers, or Wall Street bag carriers, career bag carriers like Tim Geithner. And essentially they said, let's flood the system with $800 billion. It passed in 21 days. The bill was written by all the K Street lobbies. There was something in it for everybody. Much of it was pork. Much of it went to state and local governments to carry on activities that they couldn't afford anyway. But of the $800 billion, only $30 billion went to means-tested programs like food stamps and earned income tax credit that might have been targeted on people that actually needed and deserved some help. And so we ended up, with I would call the final Keynesian flail. We ended up now with trillion-dollar deficits 4 years in a row. We ended up with a structural deficit that is huge, and even though they're telling you that it's getting better, you can't believe it for a minute. They're using rosy scenario forecasts for the next 10 years, and I know what rosy scenario forecasts are because I invented them. And I can tell you, they're very dangerous, and that if we look at the next 10 years with sober economics, which is basically cut and paste the performance of the last 10 years. That's all you have to do. And there's no reason to think it's going to get any better in the next decade. But if you cut and paste the performance of the U.S. economy, unemployment, real growth, wage and salary incomes, and so forth, of the last 10 years, you will get 15 trillion of new red ink in the 10 years ahead. And if you add that to what we have, it's north of 30 trillion. And if you do the math, it's nearly 150% of GDP, which is even more than they have in Greece today. That's the fiscal doomsday machine that's in motion. And yet, both parties are telling the public giant lies about what needs to be done. Social Security is broke, and the Democrats won't admit it. The Democrats won't allow the country to hear the truth and put on the table what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is that a means test has to be put on the affluent retirees. Nobody earned everything they're getting from Social Security or Medicare. And if it was all funded and we were a prosperous society and everything was working well, I would say fine. But it is broke. All of the reserves, $2 trillion, are just confetti. They're IOUs that were created when money came in decades and decades ago and was spent on cotton subsidies and aircraft carriers and so forth. It's not there to pay benefits as the retired population moves from 55 million on benefits today to upwards of 80 or 90 as we go ahead. So Social Security and Medicare are off the table politically when they add up to 1.5 trillion a year, 19 trillion over the next decade, and even the so-called heroic budget from Congressman Ryan gives both of them a pass for the next 10 years. So that's the heart of the budget. That is 40% of everything we spend, and the Democrats say there's no problem, and Congressman Ryan says, we'll get to it in the by and by, but for the next 10 years, the machine is just going to roll forward. The Republicans say we have enough taxes already. Not even remotely true. I don't like income taxes. We should have a better tax. I lay it out in the book. It would be better to tax consumption because we're consuming too much, saving too little, and living too high on the hog. But if you can't get the country to buy a consumption tax, then you got to ask everybody to pay more income taxes, and we did the opposite. We extended the Bush tax cuts for everybody except the 2%. Permanently in the January deal. And so the Republicans say no taxes, the Democrats say no social insurance, and both parties say the military-industrial complex is going to get its own way. But when you look at the military-industrial complex in the defense budget today, it's $650 billion, which in real terms, in other words, adjust for inflation, is 80% more than Eisenhower recommended in his outgoing budget in 1960, 80% more in same dollars, when he gave his famous military-industrial complex warning speech, and when we had a real enemy, the Soviet Union, with some crazy people in Moscow who were threatening the peace of the world. Well, here we are today with this vast war machine, massive army, land forces, navy, air forces, and so forth. And the Cold War ended 25 years ago. What replaced the Soviet Union is Russia, which is a kleptocracy. And they're more interested in stealing from each other than they are from harming their neighbors. And what is replaced Red China, if that ever really were a threat, is red capitalism, the factory of the world from which we get almost everything we use, but which could not last for 6 weeks if they actually were stupid enough to bomb all the Walmarts in America, because that's what keeps the Chinese economy going. As a matter of fact, you may wonder, why do we have 11 aircraft carriers still today? There are no industrial state enemies in the world, as I think we're all aware. And even China, the so-called next threat, has 1 aircraft carrier, 1. And where did they get it? They bought it used on the used aircraft carrier market. There is one from the Ukraine. Now, some of you may say, well, I didn't know the Ukraine was a great naval power. And the answer is, it's not a great naval power. They ended up getting an aircraft carrier when the Soviet Union fell apart. It was made in 1980. It was a rust bucket, and the Chinese bought it on the cheap because the Ukraine was desperate. Now, the only reason that I'm talking about this is it is a further kind of indication of the fiscal paralysis that has overcome the country, and of the fact that we can't even see that this vast war machine is not needed in the world that we live today. We can't even get a peace president who was elected twice on a platform of changing this imperialistic, aggressive policy that we had of invasion and occupation. But even he got in there and has a defense budget of the size that I've just laid out. So that was the 5th movement, and when we put all this together, we basically have a very unstable economic system. The economy today has not really grown appreciably since 2000. We have actually fewer full-time middle-income jobs today than we had back in 2000. The median real income of the American families is down 8%. The net worth of the bottom 90%, real net worth after inflation, is down 30% from 2000. And the reason I bring this up is that they're telling you everything is fixed, the stock market is back, it's booming today. But the truth of the matter is the stock market today is only 5% higher than it was in March 1990. In other words, 4,750 days ago, and if you're doing long division, divide by 13 and carry the 10, you'll get 13 years ago. We have a serial bubble machine that inflates financial assets in real estate and then crashes, and then reflates and then crashes, and now they're reflating it again, and you've got speculation going on everywhere. So I think the economy is in deep trouble. It's not due to a mistake that Obama made in 2009 or 2010, or Bush alone made during his tenure, or Greenspan alone. It goes back deep into history. And I appreciate you listening to all this, because now that I've completed chapter 1, I would invite all of you to relax, and we'll get to the rest of it later. But the point is, it is deeply rooted. We're heading in a very dangerous and foreboding direction. And I don't see how it's going to change. The stock market, the financial markets, Wall Street is totally wedded to money printing. You saw what happened last week when they even hinted that they might slow down the 85 billion rate. The Congress is not even in business. I don't know where they are, but certainly they're not addressing any of these fiscal issues. The Main Street economy struggles. Half of America today, half of American families have less than $20,000 worth of savings. And that, to me, is just one more indication of why this whole system isn't working. The worst thing is that even as the economy flounders and we reflate and reflate these bubbles, it seems that fewer and fewer people are ending up with all the winnings. And when you have a massive casino on Wall Street, when you have serial bubbles, it is only the speculators, it's only the people who are using the 0% money to lever up and buy assets that have a yield, junk bonds or whatever else they might be buying, real estate, the Russell 2000, the stock market index, and so on. It ends up that more and more the windfall end up in fewer and fewer hands. So here we have a tremendous income and wealth distribution problem in the United States today, the very last thing that anyone expected when they made the mistake at Camp David in 1971, or made the mistake in the Reagan White House in 81 and 82, or made the mistakes in the Eccles building that have been made repeatedly by Greenspan and Bernanke. I don't think anybody was heading in this direction, but that's where we are today. And if this continues, I believe our political system is going to break down because the American people know that it's a rigged game, it's a money-dominated game, and that the rank-and-file citizen no longer has a real voice. And in the process, the winnings are going to fewer and fewer people. So that is why I call it the Great Deformation. That's why the last chapter is called Sundown in America. I'm not trying to be some kind of pessimist, but since I've been run out of Washington on a rail 25 years ago and run out of Wall Street more recently, I have no reason not to tell the truth. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.